So, I recently got back from a trip to Disneyland Resort, and during my time there, I was fortunate enough to get to re-experience Soarin' Over California. During the Food and Wine Festival hosted in California Adventure, Disney switches Soarin' back to the original version, which is generally regarded as better than its replacement, called Soarin' Around the World. It has been almost 8 years since I experienced this version, and so I was excited to see it again. In my mind before I wrote it, I agree that this was the better version of the attraction, but I was also curious to determine what individual elements made it better. Yet, despite having enjoyed it, I got off thinking that I was wrong. I realized that I actually preferred the new version and knew that, like so many others, my perception of the original had been affected by nostalgia. Now don't get me wrong, Soarin' Over California is still a great ride, and I liked having the ability to go experience it again. However, because I found myself realizing that it didn't actually age as well as it did in my mind, I'm interested in instead breaking down the different elements of the film, analyzing why it doesn't work as well as I previously thought. Today, let's break down the California version of Soarin' and take a look at why it might not be as good as you remember. Soarin' Over California was developed as an opening day attraction for Disney California Adventure and opened with the park in 2001. Located in the Grizzly Peak area, which represents California state parks, Soarin' worked as both a celebration of aviation as well as a sensory tour of the many varied geographic locations found throughout California. Out of the many criticisms for the early era of California Adventure, Soarin' managed to stand out as an attraction that was actually really well executed, and so because it was popular, it was cloned over to Epcot and opened in the Land Pavilion in 2005. Known simply as Soarin', the film was exactly the same, but was actually the perfect fit thematically. The Land Pavilion opened in 1982 with Listen to the Land as the anchor attraction, first focusing on the importance of plants in different biomes, and then transitioning into an educational tour of the Epcot greenhouses. However, while the pavilion was focused on nutrition, an original idea that never came to fruition would have visitors board hot air balloons, taking them through different seasons and biomes that focus on educating guests on Earth's ecosystems. While Soarin' isn't educational, exploring the many varied biomes within the state of California did serve to fit thematically within the pavilion. When you really think about it, Soarin' has nothing to do with aviation, nor does it simulate hang gliding as is often implied. Instead, it's a pleasant sensory experience that is almost transcendental in nature, making it both a great fit as a showcase of California, but also as an exploration of different varied biomes. However, as the film continued to age, Disney would eventually replace it on both coasts with Soarin' Around the World in 2016. Instead exploring a variety of locations globally as you would expect from the name. This ranges from more natural environments like the Matterhorn or Iguazu Falls, to man-made landmarks such as the Pyramids of Giza. Whereas Soarin' Over California always ended with a segment that flew over Disneyland, the new version changes its ending depending on the park you experience it in. Obviously, in California Adventure, the ending was still Disneyland, but the Epcot version flew over Epcot's future world instead. When this new film premiered, it was met with a lot of disappointment, often being evaluated as inferior to the California version. But why though? What was different enough about this new film that people preferred the California version, or even denounced the new one as a bad attraction? Among the many criticisms of Soarin' Around the World, there are a few that constantly come up. The first of these is of course the theme. The variety of locations around the world are very clearly meant to fit thematically with Epcot and the World Showcase. While the original film did make sense for California Adventure, as it was of course meant to put California on display, it never quite made thematic sense for Epcot. If you ignored the California theme, the variety of locations could make sense for the Land Pavilion, but it wasn't necessarily the cleanest fit. Now in contrast, while the new film makes perfect sense for Epcot, it doesn't tie in thematically at all to California Adventure, as the theme of the park is supposed to celebrate the state. As I've highlighted through various videos though, thematic integrity isn't exactly a priority from current Disney leadership. California Adventure, while a fun park, is often a dumping ground for what leadership thinks might sell, regardless of whether or not it actually makes thematic sense. With Soarin Over California, you could at least justify its existence in Epcot if you stretched your interpretation of the film. Yet in reverse, the world theme clearly doesn't fit in California Adventure. I know that the argument for this video is that the California version isn't superior to Soarin Around the World though, so besides the theme, let's take a closer look at that. An argument that I often hear is that the new version of Soarin has a large degree of distortion. Because the attraction screen is in the shape of a dome, sitting anywhere but the seats in the very middle will lead to some comical moments. This can be found throughout the whole film, but is at its worst with tall skinny structures, such as the various hoodoos found throughout Monument Valley. Of course, if you've been on Soarin Around the World, there's a good chance that you've seen the Eiffel Tower bending to the right. Depending on where you're seated, the distortion can be so dramatic that it may even look ridiculous. However, when the film showcases flatter landscapes, the distortion isn't really a problem. People often seem to forget, but the distortion was also present in the California version. I don't really have any footage showing it, but the Golden Gate Bridge is a good example of where you can find the bending occurring prominently. Overall, this version consisted of flatter landscapes, so the distortion wasn't as noticeable, but this issue isn't unique to just the new film, so it's not a valid criticism in arguing that the original version was better. Another argument that I often see is that Soarin Around the World relies far too heavily on CGI elements. For example, the Greenland segment contains CGI polar bears, a crumbling glacier, and a jumping orca. Strangely enough, it appears that the Taj Mahal is completely CGI. I'm assuming that Disney was not able to film there, but I don't perceive the CG elements as detracting from the experience. It's not like the original film didn't have this either, as the hang glider is most definitely fake. Other elements that I assume were also added in post-production would be the skiers, Michael Eisner sending a golf ball towards the riders, and I suspect even the fighter jets and the desert scene. The use of CGI is definitely less, but it's not any more distracting around the world than it is in California. In fact, taking the time to really look, a lot of it hasn't aged well in the California film. Speaking of editing, people often complain about the difference in transitions between the two films. In the California version, it's always a straight cut to different scenes. This isn't a negative aspect because it works for this film, but in contrast, Soarin Around the World has often been criticized for using elements of the scenes to provoke a transition. Starting from the beginning, the Matterhorn scene transitions by flying into a cloud and emerging into the Greenland Glacier. This scene then uses the splash of the orca to transition to Sydney, which from there flies a plane at the screen cutting to Germany. While not all of the transitions are done this way, this was often a complaint of the new film, which in my opinion is an arbitrary judgment. It doesn't really matter to me which transitions are used, so long as they work effectively for the final product. I will say though that after getting off of Soarin Over California, I overheard other people commenting on how clunky the transition seemed. For all of the complaints about the world version, it appears that some people actually seem to prefer the more exciting nature of the transitions, and I found myself agreeing. Having broken down these various elements between the two films though, the question arises: which is better? My argument for this video is that Soarin' Over California isn't as strong as people remember it to be. Essentially, I actually see both films as pretty much equivalent, as many of the negative arguments directed towards Soarin' Around the World are either not unique to it, such as the screen distortion only being found in one version, or just simply arbitrary in a matter of preference. For example, people nostalgically remember the smell of the evergreen pine at Redwood Creek, or the smell of oranges over the orange groves. Yet, I've come to really enjoy the smell of jasmine at the Taj Mahal, the earthly grass smell of Kilimanjaro, and the tropical scent of the Fiji Islands. I also think that the content of both films is largely a matter of preference as well. Soarin' Around the World may be a bit flashier, but the different landscapes explored by both films are equally satisfying to me. I would posit that people remember Soarin' Over California as the better attraction, but I think it's really just a matter of nostalgia. Being able to experience it again recently, I was thrilled to relive the memory, but it ultimately ended up being no better than the version that replaced it. In my opinion, I really hope that the California film stays in California Adventure. It just simply makes sense for both parks to keep their more thematically appropriate films. One issue I have with current Disney leadership is their tendency to clone attractions to different resorts as a cost-saving measure. Allowing both Soarin' films to remain thematically unique to both parks allows each to feel more distinct and special when you experience them. Now that I've broken down some of the arguments concerning the Soarin' films though, I would be curious to see which you prefer. I have a feeling that the California version will win out, despite everything I just discussed, but if you have any interesting observations, I would be interested in hearing those. As always, an easy way to help the channel out is to just leave a like on the video if you like this kind of stuff. I also highly recommend subscribing with bell notification, so as to be alerted to new videos when they're released.